In Washington's charged spotlight, Jasmine Crockett exposed receipts no one expected. Lavish spending hidden in plain sight. But when a Trump heir picked up the phone and called the police on a sitting Congresswoman, America gasped. Since when did speaking truth become a crime? And what happens when silence is no longer an option? Before we get to this explosive moment, tell us where you're watching from. And if you believe truth still matters, hit subscribe. We've got another jaw-dropping story coming tomorrow. The studio lights in Washington flickered low, casting long shadows across the desk, where the night's final segment was about to close. It had been a quiet interview, calm by the standards of cable news, until Jasmine Crockett leaned forward and delivered a line that seemed to split the air like thunder. Public funds are for them. Public, if that offends you, ask yourself why. The words weren't shouted. They weren't wrapped in anger. They were steady, deliberate, and sharp enough to leave silence hanging over the set. The host blinked, caught off guard, shuffling notes as though buying time. The cameras didn't cut away quickly. They lingered, holding the moment longer than anyone expected, giving viewers at home the rare chance to feel the weight of stillness on live television. In that silence, it wasn't just an interview anymore. It was a confrontation with an idea too raw to dismiss. Then, like glass shattering, the calm fractured. Screens lit up with breaking news alerts. Across networks, a headline began to stack, one after another, crawling across the bottom of televisions in living rooms and bars. Barron Trump files complaint against Crockett. For a nation used to political brawls, this was something else entirely. A teenage son of a former president had dialed law enforcement. The studio cut to flashing overlays, red and blue police sirens blazing across Jasmine's calm expression. The contrast was jarring, surreal, almost cinematic in its absurdity. One moment she was explaining campaign finance mechanics. The next, she was treated as though speaking truth had crossed into criminal territory. And then the voiceover, carried like a challenge to the country itself. Since when did oversight harassment? Since when do questions get treated like crimes? The rhetorical question reverberated louder than any accusation. For viewers, it wasn't just politics anymore. It was about the cost of asking the wrong question in the wrong room, and what it meant that silence could still be weaponized by those who inherited power. The silence had broken, and in the fracture, America was left to wonder whose voice would be punished next. Jasmine Crockett's story didn't begin under television lights or within the walls of Congress. It began in Dallas courtrooms, in files stacked higher than her desk, in hallways where public defenders fought to hold back the tide of systemic neglect. She had been a lawyer long before she had been a politician, and it showed in the way she carried herself. She didn't stride into hearings to deliver zingers for social media. She arrived with binders, annotated margins, and color-coded tabs. In her world, evidence wasn't an accessory. It was survival. She had learned early that silence often played in favor of power. The unspoken assumption was always that the less you said, the more you could get away with. Agencies ignored requests. Corporations buried records. Families without resources had no choice but to whisper in frustration. Jasmine refused to join that culture. Whispering meant complicity. Her ethos was built on refusing silence, on turning what others wanted to hide into a matter of public record. Her method was simple, even if it often seemed unglamorous. Receipts over rhetoric. She would sit for hours with Freedom of Information Act responses, scanning through black bars of redacted pages to piece together truths others missed. She didn't like drama for drama's sake. Her fights came only after she had documented the timeline, the purchase order, the invoice trail. When she did explode on a public stage, it was never because of an impulsive flash of anger. It was because the evidence was finally lined up, each page in sequence, ready to be revealed. In the days leading up to her clash with the Trump family, the evidence arrived in a way routine and explosive. A courier packet was dropped at her office, its plain manila exterior disguising what sat inside. It contained event expense filings tied to Mar-a-Lago gatherings, line items for orchids flown in from South America, champagne towers billed as essential ambiance, charges filed under decorative experience. So vague and so indulgent they almost mocked the very idea of fiscal responsibility. Jasmine didn't react with outrage right away. She flipped pages calmly, highlighting, flagging, noting which records came directly from federal allocations and which slid through campaign loopholes. Her chief of staff, Ava Ditt, was the one who finally broke the quiet tension of the office. Ava had been with her long enough to know when a packet meant trouble. "They'll spin this personal," Ava warned, leaning over the edge of Jasmine's desk. "They'll say you're targeting families, targeting appearances. They'll drown you in accusations." Jasmine didn't flinch. She stacked the papers neatly and set her pen down. "Good," she said, her voice low but deliberate. "Let them. Records remain." She knew the cost of speaking truth against privilege. She also knew what it meant to have the receipts, and that knowledge made her calm, even as the storm gathered beyond the walls of her office. If Jasmine was preparing with binders and highlighters, the Trump world was polishing its image with rehearsed restraint. Melania Trump, though often described as detached from politics, was in fact central to the family's aura. Her curated elegance, her careful silences, and her mastery of branding turned events into theater. When receipts showed lavish decor at Mar-a-Lago galas, it wasn't incidental. It was her signature. Orchids weren't flowers, they were stage props. Champagne towers weren't beverages, they were proof that power could still display itself like royalty. Donald Trump, by contrast, leaned into confrontation with characteristic force. For him, any scrutiny was an attack, and every attack was an attack on family. He had perfected the art of transforming oversight into persecution. When Jasmine's comments surfaced, he didn't parse the details of invoices or orchids. He told supporters this was another witch hunt, this time targeting his wife and child. That framing, repeated across rallies and interviews, shifted the spotlight away from paperwork and into the realm of loyalty politics. To question receipts was, in his telling, to question the very legitimacy of his family. The most unexpected figure in this drama, however, was Barron Trump. At 18, he had not been a fixture of the public stage, shielded for years from the scrutiny that enveloped his father. But privilege has a way of colliding with pressure. When he saw headlines suggesting his mother's events were under congressional examination, he acted impulsively. His call to police, it was the spark that turned simmering tension into national spectacle. A teenager's instinct to defend his family had thrust him into the sharpest light imaginable. The spin machine was waiting. Colby Dent, the family's sharp-tongued press secretary, fanned the flames with statements that blurred reality into narrative. He told reporters that Crockett's obsession with receipts was nothing more than harassment. Within hours, conservative representatives like Earl Maddox and Shelton Briggs seized the moment. They promised censure votes, condemned what they called an assault on family dignity, and filled cable news slots with outrage. To them, this wasn't about orchids or champagne. It was about drawing a line in the sand, protecting the Trump name at all costs. Meanwhile, the media was primed to feast. America, already weary of hypocrisy and hungry for spectacle, tuned in. Some viewers rolled their eyes, tired of politics as entertainment. Others leaned forward, sensing the absurdity of a teenager summoning law enforcement to guard champagne towers and decorative ambiance. The divide sharpened, one side furious at oversight treated as seriously, the other exhausted but unwilling to ignore the surreal drama unfolding in real time. Jasmine's calm precision and the Trump family's theatrical defensiveness had finally collided. And in that collision, the country braced for the kind of showdown that would be replayed, dissected, and remembered long after the sirens faded. The studio lights of Inside the Beltway glared hotter than usual that night. The primetime slot was meant to be routine, a discussion about federal budget priorities, the kind of segment that usually dissolved into vague talking points and polite evasions. The host shuffled his note cards, preparing to steer the conversation toward defense spending and infrastructure. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett sat poised, hands folded on the desk, her expression calm but unreadable. The host began with his practiced cadence. "Congresswoman, the public has a lot of questions about where taxpayer dollars are being allocated, particularly in times of economic strain. Can you give us your view on what Congress should prioritize?" It was the kind of soft lob question designed to avoid controversy, a chance for a politician to give a harmless answer. But Jasmine had no interest in harmless answers. She leaned forward slightly, her voice firm yet measured. "Taxpayer dollars shouldn't fund luxury events when school lunches are cut." The words landed like a stone dropped into water, sending ripples across the studio. For a moment, silence filled the room. The host blinked, unprepared. A producer's pen audibly dropped behind the cameras. The pause stretched longer than anyone expected, long enough for viewers at home to feel it. The host scrambled. "Congresswoman, are you implying—" "Implying," Jasmine cut in before he could finish, her voice sharper this time. "We've seen the records. If they deny it, fine. But don't pretend this is new." Her eyes didn't waver, and the camera, perhaps by instinct, lingered on her face. The studio suddenly felt charged, as if the walls themselves recognized something historic had just been said. The host tried again, shifting in his chair, his hand twitching nervously with the papers in front of him. "Well, to be clear, you're making a very direct accusation about the former First Family." "I'm making a statement of fact," Jasmine said, interrupting again with a steady hand gesture. "Budgets don't lie. Receipts don't lie. If people are uncomfortable with the truth, that's not my problem. It's the problem of anyone who thinks taxpayer money is theirs to spend on orchids and champagne towers." The silence returned, thicker now. It was the kind of silence that precedes something irreversible. The host looked at his producer, panic flickering in his eyes. The control booth made the call, cutting abruptly to commercial. The network jingle filled the air, but the moment had already been carved into stone. Viewers across the country sat forward in their living rooms, phones buzzing as clips of the exchange were instantly clipped and shared. In the silence of that commercial break, everyone in the studio knew it. A fuse had been lit. By the time Jasmine left the studio and returned to her modest DC apartment, her phone was vibrating nonstop. News alerts, text messages, missed calls from reporters. It was as if the entire city had decided to descend on her in one night. Standing outside her building, her chief of staff, Ava Ditt, met her with wide eyes and a phone in hand. "It's viral," Ava said simply, holding up the screen. Jasmine didn't need to see the trending hashtags to know what had happened. "Good," she replied calmly, brushing past Ava as they entered the building. "Maybe they'll listen now." Across town, in the ornate dining room of his private residence, Donald Trump was not calm. The clink of silverware against porcelain stopped as he slammed his fork onto the plate. "Make it about family. Hit her hard." His voice echoed across the gilded walls, sharp enough to make aides flinch. Colby Dent, the family's press secretary, scribbled notes furiously, already drafting statements that would transform Jasmine's receipts into personal insults. "Say she's obsessed," Trump continued, pointing his finger at Colby. "Say she's harassing my wife, my son. Don't make it about money. Make it about dignity." The machine moved quickly. By dawn, hashtags like "Potdeet Stop the Smear" and "Poshcast Our Families" began to trend, pushed by coordinated networks of influencers and media allies. Yet the counterforce rose just as fast. Jasmine's supporters flooded timelines with their own message: public funds, public truth, and Shoney stand with Crockett. Clips of her firm response on air circulated endlessly, often with captions like, Even those who had no interest in politics couldn't resist replaying the clip. Caroline Leavitt, a rising Republican voice known for her combative style, sat in her office watching Jasmine's composure on repeat. She said nothing publicly, but her silence spoke louder than any press release. Even political opponents recognized the sheer precision of Jasmine's delivery. The escalation reached a surreal new height when Barron Trump, only recently an adult, acted on impulse. Incensed at what he perceived as an attack on his mother, he called the DC police late at night, filing a complaint against Jasmine Crockett. The report described harassment of a family, language unmoored from the reality of congressional oversight. Jasmine received the call the next morning from Sergeant Duca, a weary officer caught in the middle of political theater. "Congresswoman, I'm required to inform you a complaint has been filed. It's unusual." His tone carried disbelief, as if even he could not process the absurdity of explaining orchids and champagne towers in the same breath as alleged harassment. Jasmine hung up the phone, set it down gently, and let out a slow exhale. Ava, watching her from across the room, broke the silence. "This is not politics as usual anymore." Jasmine nodded. The storm had officially crossed into the realm of the surreal. The leak came swiftly, as leaks always do. Within hours, political blogs published headlines blaring, "Barron Trump files police report against Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett." Screenshots of the complaint spread across social media, accompanied by disbelief, mockery, and outrage in equal measure. Conservative anchors seized the story, labeling Jasmine's actions extremism. One host declared, "This is the kind of harassment that shows just how radical oversight has become." They spoke of family privacy, of sacred boundaries, framing Jasmine as a predator rather than a representative. On the other side, progressive explainers rushed to clarify. "Oversight is not harassment," they repeated. "Congress has a duty to ask questions. Receipts are not personal attacks, they are accountability." The clash spilled onto every channel. Panels of commentators bickered late into the night, each side claiming moral high ground. The absurdity of orchids and champagne towers became a national metaphor, a shorthand for waste and privilege versus scrutiny and truth. Outside the Capitol, Jasmine faced the press directly. Microphones crowded inches from her face as questions shouted from every direction. She stood steady, her voice carrying above the noise. "Oversight isn't optional, it's my job. And no, I won't apologize." She repeated it once more, slower this time, her gaze cutting through the sea of cameras. "I won't." The words echoed, clipped into sound bites that ricocheted across the internet within minutes. Young voters picked it up as a rallying cry. Veterans posted videos supporting her stance, saying they had sacrificed too much for accountability to be treated as harassment. Teachers wrote open letters online, connecting her words to the underfunded schools they worked in daily. Everywhere the phrase appeared. She asked a question. The divide hardened. To her critics, Jasmine had crossed a line. To her supporters, she had drawn the only line that mattered. The spectacle was no longer about receipts, it was about who had the courage to confront privilege without blinking. Ava caught up with her as the crowd dispersed. "This won't stop here," she warned, her voice urgent. Jasmine nodded, exhaustion momentarily flickering across her face before she steadied herself again. Deep down, they both knew the truth. The first blows had already landed, and neither side was prepared to back down. The moment the clip aired, the ecosystem of American media did what it always does with combustible material. It magnified it, amplified it, and replayed it until it burned itself into the national psyche. Jasmine Crockett's calm face, her deliberate cadence as she uttered the words "taxpayer dollars shouldn't fund luxury events when school lunches are cut," became the still frame of the week. On the other side of the screen, the host's frozen reaction and the producer's pen clattering to the floor were spliced into endless highlight reels. Twitter, TikTok, cable news chyrons, they all converged. 3 hashtags emerged as weapons in a digital trench war. Public, from its public truth, pushed by activists and educators who hailed Crockett's insistence on receipts. Barron. Called 911, an ironic meme used by late-night comedians and Gen Z TikTokers to mock the surreal image of an 18-year-old calling the police over a congressional statement. And only the miter cuts or data could give it presagient. Known or comely should carefully curated by the Trump orbit, branding Crockett's oversight as nothing more than harassment cloaked in faux accountability. Networks leaned in with predictable fervor. Progressive anchors looped Crockett's line with celebratory tones, some replaying it like a rallying cry. Conservative networks framed it as an unprecedented attack on the dignity of family, deliberately avoiding the actual receipts that had triggered the firestorm. But what neither side could escape was the absurdity of the police report. Even centrists, who often defaulted to caution, struggled to keep straight faces as they described a young Trump placing a 911 call over congressional oversight. Late-night comedians smelled blood in the water. One joked, "Imagine explaining to dispatch that your emergency is receipts for champagne towers." Another held up a mock phone and intoned, "Yes, officer? Someone just used facts against me." Studio audiences roared, but the laughter carried an undertone of disbelief, because beneath the comedy was a chilling truth. A family so shielded by power that even accountability felt criminal to them. Meanwhile, TikTok lawyers and young civics teachers began using the moment as a teachable case study. Viral clips circulated where lawyers broke down campaign finance basics, line by line, explaining why funds labeled as decorative ambiance in political filings mattered. Teachers filmed themselves creating chalkboard diagrams titled "The Trust Chain," challenging students to trace how taxpayer dollars were supposed to move from treasury to program without detours into orchids and luxury seating. And then there were the edits. Fast-cut TikToks where Crockett's line played over a beat drop, interspersed with siren overlays and freeze frames of Barron's name on the police complaint. The internet had done what the internet does. It turned something deadly serious into cultural shorthand. The tension between humor and outrage kept the story alive, refusing to let it fade. Within days, mainstream newspapers ran front-page stories that mixed both scandal and spectacle. Oversight or overstep, asked the Washington Post. From receipts to 911 calls, the Crockett question, declared USA Today. The New York Times simply called it the clash that broke the silence. In less than 72 hours, Crockett's words had detonated far beyond a single studio appearance. The media was no longer covering a budget oversight hearing. It was covering an American confrontation over truth itself. If the media ignited the explosion, it was ordinary Americans who carried the shockwave into every corner of daily life. Cafeterias, barbershops, coffee counters, PTA meetings. Spaces once reserved for small talk, buzzed with debates about Jasmine Crockett, taxpayer money, and what counted as accountability versus attack. In Houston, a cafeteria worker was overheard telling a colleague, "She's right. We run out of milk cartons by Wednesday and they're throwing galas with champagne towers." In Iowa, a barber leaned over his chair and asked, "You going to tell me questioning receipts is harassment? Since when?" Yet in a church basement in Alabama, a volunteer countered, "This isn't about receipts. It's about respect. Families are off limits. Period." Flash polls released by neutral research groups painted a divided picture. Among independents, the phrase "necessary truth" gained traction. Majorities agreed that oversight of public spending was essential, even if uncomfortable. Among moderates, the split was sharper. Some felt Crockett had pierced the silence that needed piercing, while others recoiled at the idea of dragging children, however adult-aged, into the fray. Among partisans, there was no ambiguity. Supporters of Donald Trump and his orbit hardened into defensive lines, while Crockett's backers elevated her to a near-folk hero status. Inside her office, Jasmine's staff found themselves inundated with letters and emails, many from people who rarely wrote to Washington at all. A retired schoolteacher sent a note scribbled in shaky cursive, "We carried papers like armor during the civil rights years. Thank you for asking who else should be carrying them today." A mother in Arizona wrote, "Every time my son drives, I remind him to keep insurance and registration visible. If power can purchase exceptions, then my fear is permanent." The resonance was unmistakable. For every attack calling her reckless, there was an equally fervent thank you letter from someone who felt seen. Meanwhile, the silence of Caroline Leavitt, normally quick to amplify Trump world defenses nets, became its own story. Cable anchors openly wondered why the usually combative spokesperson had canceled 2 appearances. "If this was just spin, wouldn't she be out there spinning?" asked one commentator. The implication was obvious. Even some inside the machinery seemed stunned into speechlessness. The ripple reached high schools and college campuses, where student debates turned into mini-trials. On one campus, debate club flyers read, "Resolved? Oversight is not harassment." On another, student government leaders voted to symbolically stand with Crockett in defense of public accountability. The generational dimension was unavoidable. Young people, raised in an era of receipts, screenshots, and documentation, were inclined to side with the Congresswoman who had dared to demand exactly that. The split was everywhere, and it was raw. For some, it was an attack on family dignity. For others, it was a necessary defense of the public purse. But for all, it was inescapable. Jasmine Crockett had forced America to confront a question it preferred to whisper, about how much silence is too much when power is unchecked. Even as the public divided, institutions moved with their own heavy gravity. In the House, Representatives Earl Maddox and Shelton Briggs seized the moment to formally file articles of censure against Jasmine Crockett. The filing wasn't unexpected, but the theatrics that accompanied it were. Cable networks plastered countdown clocks on the screen. Crockett, censure, vote in 72 hours. Pundits speculated on whether Democrats would splinter, whether moderates would fold, and whether the symbolic rebuke would dim or intensify her fire. Leaks from inside the White House painted a portrait of division. According to reporters, First Lady Melania Trump was privately upset, telling confidants that the story needed to die quickly. She reportedly believed that prolonging it only magnified the receipts themselves. But Donald Trump, never one to step away from combat, doubled down. At one fundraiser, he thundered, "They want to shame us for success. They want to police our celebrations." Base roared, but even some of his advisors cringed at the framing, because it underscored the very luxury details that Crockett had spotlighted. Outside Washington, small but symbolic protests sprouted. Groups gathered on courthouse steps, holding handmade signs. Public money, public answers. In Philadelphia, a group of teachers marched with receipts taped to their jackets. In Dallas, union members held a candlelight vigil framed not as partisan protest, but as a demand for honesty in public spending. Behind the scenes, the Oversight Committee made a quiet but consequential move. Requests were sent for supporting documents related to the expenses flagged by Crockett. While overshadowed by the louder headlines, the bureaucratic paper trail was beginning to spool, and insiders knew that once documents were formally logged, the story could not be easily dismissed as rhetoric. And then, the unexpected crack. Caroline Leavitt, after nearly a week of silence, finally appeared on camera. Her words were careful, but they carried weight. "We owe voters clarity." It wasn't a surrender. It was framed as a commitment to transparency. But to many watching, it was the first acknowledgement from within Trump's circle that ignoring the receipts outright was no longer an option. Institutional Washington thrives on calculation, and this statement set off alarms. Was Leavitt freelancing, or was she signaling a pivot? Was the Trump machine beginning to realize that silence could not smother Crockett's line? Whatever the answer, the impact was unmistakable. The clash was no longer just media noise. It was bending the institutions themselves, forcing them to contend with questions of accountability they preferred to bury. By the end of the week, it was clear. What had begun as a studio interview had detonated into a national confrontation, splitting the public, forcing institutions to respond, and leaving the question hanging like an unrelenting drumbeat. If oversight is framed as harassment, who will ever dare to ask again? The Capitol steps had never felt so heavy under Jasmine Crockett's shoes. Reporters crowded her like bees to honey, their microphones stretching forward, shouting questions that blurred together. "Do you regret it, Congresswoman? Will you apologize to the Trump family? Did you expect Barron Trump to go this far?" The frenzy was not about the orchids or the champagne towers anymore. It was about a teenager's police call and a nation caught with whom. Jasmine stood still, her spine straight, her voice even. She said only, "Oversight is not harassment. The public's money deserves public answers." And then, she walked inside, leaving the cameras scrambling for reactions they could twist. But the true reckoning came not in those press scrums, but in the silence of her apartment later that evening. Ava sat on the couch, scrolling furiously through updates. Hashtags swung like pendulums, dividing the country in real time. Supporters hailed Jasmine as fearless, a congresswoman unbending before dynasty. Critics branded her reckless, cruel, even dangerous. The cruelty stung more when it came wrapped in personal venom. Photos of her family, doctored memes, whispered threats about her safety. Ava looked up, her voice tight. "They're going after you as a woman, as a black woman, as someone who dared to stand in their line of fire." Jasmine exhaled slowly, pressing her palms together. "That's the point. They want silence, but if we stay silent, they win." Meanwhile, across the river, in a gilded dining room where power and resentment mixed like whiskey and ice, Donald Trump raged. He slammed his glass on the table, his voice shaking the chandeliers. "She went after Melania. She went after my family. That's not oversight, that's war." Colby Dent scribbled spin lines while loyal allies rehearsed outrage they would carry onto Fox and the House floor. But Melania sat quietly, her face unreadable, her hand on her chin. For her, the circus of politics was always unbearable. What stung was that Jasmine's words had not been false. The receipts existed. The orchids and champagne towers were real. Melania whispered almost to herself, It should have never been public money. Donald didn't hear, or pretended not to. At the same hour, Barron Trump sat in his room, scrolling through a feed that now bore his name in neon across every screen. Barron called 911 trended not as sympathy but as satire. Late-night comedians turned his call into punchlines. Teenagers on TikTok reenacted his harassment claim with mock police reports against their parents. Barron buried his face in his hands, realizing too late that his attempt to defend his experiment had made him a national spectacle. The personal earthquake rattled everyone differently. Jasmine steeled herself for the next wave. The Trump family fractured in whispers and rants, and the American public split into camps that no pollster could fully measure. The morning offer felt like an election night, though no ballots had been cast. Every network opened with the same split screen. Jasmine Crockett outside the Capitol repeating her mantra, "Oversight is not harassment," against Donald Trump thundering at a rally stage declaring, "They're attacking my family." The contrast was stark, almost cinematic. One voice calm, deliberate, almost judicial. The other fiery, pounding fists, rallying a base with grievances dressed as patriotism. America was forced to choose not between parties, but between visions of accountability. Inside Congress, the reckoning took form in procedural steel. Representatives Earl Maddox and Shelton Briggs marched to the clerk's desk with a censure motion drafted overnight. They staged press conferences, with lines rehearsed to ignite headlines. "This is not about oversight, this is about obsession," Maddox thundered. Yet even as their words aired live, a different picture formed online. Citizens posting photos of potholes, schools with crumbling ceilings, hospitals underfunded, all with captions asking, "And orchids? Got funded instead?" The censure effort had energy, but not inevitability. Were poured into Jasmine's office by the hundreds. Some scrawled in pen on lined paper, others typed with precision. A teacher from Michigan wrote, "Every day I see kids share books because we don't have enough copies. Thank you for asking why orchids matter more." A veteran from Ohio added, "Oversight is not harassment, it is the promise we fought for." These voices fortified Jasmine even as death threats arrived alongside them. Ava read the letters aloud in their office, a reminder that while institutions twisted, the people, the real people, understood. But the deeper reckoning stretched beyond Jasmine or the Trumps. It landed on institutions that had long blurred the line between privilege and accountability. Oversight committees, often dismissed as theater, now faced public eyes demanding action. Staffers whispered about document requests, subpoenas drafted in shadow. Networks ran countdown clocks not just for censure votes, but for the next hearing, the next revelation. In PTA meetings and barbershops, people argued not about orchids or champagne towers, but about whether America could still trust that public money served the public. The most striking crack came from an unexpected corner. Caroline Leavitt, who had sat stunned into silence during the first viral clip, finally broke her quiet. At a conservative luncheon, she hesitated, then said, "We owe voters clarity. If the documents exist, then clarity must be given." It wasn't surrender, but it was a fissure, a signal that even loyal allies could not ignore receipts forever. In politics, silence is survival, but cracks are where light gets in. The reckoning was not final, not settled. It stretched like storm clouds across Washington, promising thunder still to come. But one truth was undeniable. The teenager's police call meant to silence Jasmine Crockett had, instead, magnified her voice. What began as a confrontation over orchids and champagne towers had become a trial of democracy itself. The question now was simple and seismic. Would accountability bend before power, or would power finally bow to accountability? The echoes of this confrontation will not fade quickly. In fact, they already belong to history. A congresswoman stood firm, armed with nothing but the truth on paper, and faced down a dynasty accustomed to bending every challenge into performance. In that moment, under those lights, Jasmine Crockett proved that power cannot silence records. Receipts have their own voice, and when wielded with precision, they drown out every insult, every smear, every desperate attempt to twist the story. What began as a fight over orchids and champagne towers became something larger. It became a mirror held up to America itself. Do we accept that public money can vanish into private indulgence, while classrooms, hospitals, and neighborhoods go without? Do we surrender the principle that oversight is harassment, or do we reclaim the idea that Accountability is patriotism. Those questions now rest not just in Congress, but in every kitchen table conversation, in every PTA meeting, in every place where people whisper that they are tired of being lied to. Jasmine's words will echo for years. Oversight is not harassment. The public's money deserves public answers. It is a sentence that belongs not to her alone, but to every voter, every taxpayer, every citizen who has ever wondered why sacrifice flows upward while accountability trickles down. It reminds us that democracy is not defended by silence, but by those willing to speak when speaking is costly. The Trump machine will not forget this wound. They will spin, they will shout, they will thunder on rally stages and cable screens. But beneath the noise, cracks have appeared. Even allies now whisper that clarity is necessary. Even supporters admit the optics cannot be ignored. The spectacle Barron Trump tried to end with a single call to 911 became the very spark that ensured his family could no longer hide behind shadows. And that is where the responsibility falls, to us. Because truth without witnesses is fragile. Truth without amplification can be buried. Jasmine Crockett carried the paper trail, but the weight of those papers must now be shared by the people. By us. By you. If America is to survive as more than performance, we must demand receipts everywhere power spends our lives. So here is the call. Do not let this moment vanish into another news cycle. Share it, debate it, teach it, carry it like armor. Ask your representatives where the money goes. Ask why orchids and champagne matter more than teachers and veterans. And when they stumble, when they bristle, when they call it harassment, remind them that silence is the enemy of democracy. The future does not belong to those who hide. It belongs to those who demand light. And tonight, in this story, light was demanded, and it will keep burning so long as we refuse to look away.